Welcome. I'm Ron Baker. This is Us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast is being held today with our local general ministerial here in Kindersley, Saskatchewan, and they're supporting me, and we look forward to a bit of question and answer as we go along. We are social distanced around our table. We pastor in Kindersley, Saskatchewan, about 4,500 people. We all pastor small churches, less than 100. I'm looking around, they're all nodding. Yeah, less than 100 in attendance. Particularly in this time of COVID, it's really, we're down to 30 now. Prayer and discussion. We try to follow the government regulations. And that's why you're looking at masks today, the chances that you get to look at us. And we look great, I'm sure. Our guests today are Rick Heimstra and Lindsay Callaway of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. They're interested in small churches, so much so that they're heading up a research effort to understand small churches better. So we'll pop right in here. Let's get going, and we'll let them introduce themselves and see where we end up after that. So here we go. I'll start with Rick. Rick, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, your ministry journeys, any? You can tell us what color you like, doesn't matter, whatever, go for it.
Okay, my name is Rick Heimstra. I work as the Director of Research at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. I work with Lindsay. And in terms of a ministry journey, I've also been a small church pastor. I pastored a small Wesleyan church in Cornwall, Ontario for 6 years before coming to the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And been doing research here now with the EFC for about 13 years. So that's a very brief introduction. I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Thanks, Rick. Yes, my name is Lindsay Callaway, and I've been with the EFC for just over a year and a half now as a researcher. I live in Ottawa with my husband, who is a pastor, and currently we attend a larger church, but I have grown up in a small church context.
Now, the small church context that you were in was Renfrew, Ontario, was it? Or?
Yes, that was my town. I actually attended a church in the neighboring town called Arnprior.
Oh, yeah. Some people here are nodding. There's a few people that understand Ontario in this ministerial. So,
Great.
Yeah. And when you say small church, how big a church would it have been?
Just under 100.
Okay, great. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm not sure which one of you want to start, or you can both talk at the same time and we'll see double pictures, whatever. How would you describe the research project that you guys are doing on small churches?
Well, let me just give you a bit of background. This research project was initiated by Ron Johnson of Small Church Connections, and he approached us and wanted to do something that looked at small churches and the needs of small churches. And so we held a consultation and organized a partnership to sort of fund and direct that research. And there's a list of, I think, about 11 organizations, the Apostolic Church of Pentecost. I'm going to read them all just because I think they deserve to have some notoriety here. The Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada, the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec, Canadian Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches, the Canadian and Missionary Alliance, the Evangelical Free Church of Canada, Pine Woods Chapel and Vision Ministries Canada, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, the Wesleyan Church of Canada, Tyndale University, and Small Church Connections. So that's the group that's kind of behind the research. In terms of what the research project is, we are doing a number of phases or steps to the project. First, we did a literature review looking at what's sort of been written. What do we know about small churches, particularly small churches in Canada? And then we did a round of interviews with ministry experts. So these are people that would teach in seminaries. We included some denominational leaders, some pastors, some small church pastors as well. And we've written one interim report for our partners on that. And we'll be drawing on that as we answer questions today. And then the next phase, we're in the middle of doing 30 interviews with small church pastors from across Canada. And then finally, we will be conducting a national survey of small church pastors. And that will be, the writing of that will be informed by what we learn in our interviews.
What part, as a researcher, what does that mean you've been doing?
Lindsay, do you want to take that one?
Run with
Sure.
it.
So I think as a researcher, we've really become listeners. One of the things that I've noticed some of the pastors, the small church pastors have said is that they aren't represented often in church literature or in church conferences because a lot of them cater to sort of these large church contexts or what's flashy or what might be more noticeable or garner more attention. So it's been a privilege as a researcher to be able to be a listener and to give some of these small churches a platform to be heard. And we ask a few questions that we've tried to tailor to what would be relevant to a small church pastor's experience. And they've been very generous in sharing their experiences and their highs and their lows, some of their frustrations, but a lot of victories as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's the favorite question that you've asked? Your favorite?
Well, one of the things we ask all of the pastors that we're talking to is, well, we ask a couple questions. How do you define a small church? Like, what makes a church small? And another one is, what makes for a successful small church ministry? And we ask them why. So
those are two good questions.
Well,
that may not be your favorite, Rick. I understand that.
Well, it is kind of interesting, the answer to the question of what makes for a small church. Often people might think that we would be talking about Sunday morning attendance, but often it has to do with things like the feel of the congregation, that everybody's family, that everyone knows everyone else, and that it's close. And sometimes it has to do with what we call size dynamics. And size dynamics is just, here are the people that you have available to do the ministry that's in front of you. And the number of people that you have dictates how you can do it. And that's another thing that makes small. So often what people will say is, you're small until you get that second paid full-time staff person, or maybe a reliable volunteer, that kind of thing. And then what makes us, what do people often say about what makes a small church successful? They'll often talk about faithfulness. And there's this idea that sort of has arisen in our conversations with small church pastors that there, in most small churches, there's kind of an unwritten, unspoken congregational covenant. This is a covenant with each other, kind of about what is our small church about. And really what is success is sort of faithfulness to this common, shared, maybe unarticulated understanding about what this congregation is in this community, and our calling to this community in place. And often, especially in rural churches, there is a very strong sense of a calling to a community and a place.
Okay, Lindsay.
I think one of my favorite questions to ask pastors is describe a work week and tell me what that looks like.
Yeah.
I hear some chuckles.
Chuckles, all right.
Just how much that these pastors are cramming into their weeks is really extraordinary. And some of the things that you would not expect. This isn't a class that you took in seminary, having to fill out your CRA forms or call the internet and phone provider and figure out the plan for the church. Some of them are setting up all of the chairs for the Sunday morning worship service. Some of these things that you don't always expect to hear in a pastor's work week. You expect it to be sermon preparation and counseling and maybe a few administrative tasks. But we've noticed that one pastor put it, he said, I might share the same title as a larger church pastor, but our job descriptions look very different. And so I really like to hear how these work weeks are segmented and how they get everything done.
You've got all sorts of nods going on table, no question about it. Let's go back, Rick, to a question. How has COVID affected your research, and what type of things are you learning from COVID?
Well, in terms of our research, it hasn't affected it a lot because we were always going to do our interviews over the phone. But in terms of how it's affecting small churches, it has been a struggle for many small churches to adopt the technology to move their worship services online. And a lot of them, although at the point that we're interviewing them now, they've made that switch. They expressed some frustration with that process and expressed a wish that they had had more help making that transition. As far as what it has done to their communities, a lot of them have told us that once they've moved online, that actually the number of people that they reach has gone up. In many cases, some of them will tell us that they're reaching twice as many people on a Sunday as they were when they were holding in-person services. Now, this fluctuates a lot with COVID because we kind of move in and out of lockdown in different jurisdictions, but some of them have begun to move back to in-person services, and some of those people, it remains to be seen whether those people that they were touching through Facebook live broadcasts or Zoom services are going to continue with them. But in many cases, it's been a good news story. The other thing that they've told us is that because in small churches, people have these very strong, tight relationships, a lot of pastoral work has moved into back to, I guess, an older form of communication, the phone tree, where you phone people on a weekly basis, checking up on them, seeing how they're doing. But, in many cases, I think that small churches have done better than large churches. We're not studying large churches, but anecdotally, I hear stories about large churches having more trouble, I guess, than small churches through the pandemic.
Now, in about 3-4 minutes, I'm going to ask for question and answers, and I have a feeling needed here. First thing, before we get there, having done the research up to this point, are you discouraged, encouraged about the small church? I'll get both of you to take that away.
Lindsay?
Go ahead, Lindsay.
When I was thinking about this question, my first instinct was to say I'm sometimes discouraged for small churches, but very encouraged by them. It seems like the odds are stacked against small churches. It's hard to find really quality leadership or dependable volunteers. Finances always seem to be something that's a struggle at times. And so it seems like, how does ministry ever get done in this context? But the stories that I'm hearing are very encouraging, and many pastors feel or have communicated to us that they're seeing change in their congregants, and many of them have articulated that as a standard by which they measure success. Am I being faithful, and are people being changed? And it sounds like people really are being changed in the small church, and they're able to have a very intimate relationship with their pastor, and they feel seen, they feel like they're part of a family. And so I think this is something that's really wonderful about the small church, and something that I've been very encouraged by.
And I think there's something to realize is that the measures of growth or success are different in a small church than in a large one. And many small church pastors will tell us, yes, they're looking for growth, but it's spiritual growth in their people. And they're very happy if they get numerical growth as well. But they're looking for the spiritual growth in their people, and they can measure that because they're living their lives alongside the people in their congregation. They know their stories, they know how their stories are evolving, they know the relationships that they have. Whereas, a denomination might want to measure numbers like attendance or membership, or that kind of thing. But one of the things we've realized is that, the reason the denominations emphasize those kinds of numbers is because they don't have the relationships that would allow them to measure spiritual growth. Like, your district superintendent doesn't know your people. And so what they can count is what they're able to count, and those are those numbers. And so when small church pastors talk to us, they're talking about, am I seeing that spiritual growth in my people? Are they having a greater impact in their community? And if they are seeing that and they're being faithful to what we've been calling the congregational covenant, then that's a successful situation for small churches, and they're happy with that kind of trajectory for their congregation.
So the study is not done yet, but it's still continuing. Is there anything particular from either one of you or both of you that you would like to see accomplished itself?
I think that one of the things that pastors have been telling us about is that they feel kind of misunderstood by their denominations, or as Lindsay said, ignored by their denominations or undervalued by their denominations. And if we are able to give voice to small churches, small church pastors, and their own understanding of their ministry, so that denominations and their sister congregations within their denominations or communities understand them better and value them for the kinds of congregations that they are, then I think if we're able to do that, I think that this will be a successful piece of research.
Maybe to add to that, we noticed in our interviews maybe 3 areas where small church pastors tended to communicate sort of a distrust or a misunderstanding or a strained relationship. And that was, as Rick said, generally with denominations, but also with large churches not always knowing how to relate to small churches, and also with educational institutions feeling that maybe they're not preparing pastors well for small church ministry, but teaching models that are more conducive to large churches, which just doesn't seem to make sense when there are proportionally more small churches than large churches out there. So I think if we're able to see denominations, large churches, and these educational institutions having more understanding about small church ministry, and maybe even being able to strengthen the relationships with small churches, that would be a great outcome from this report.
Okay, this is all good. I'm enjoying this. Turn this over to question and answers. You're not going to see who's speaking. They may want to remain anonymous, or they may want to, but we'll just turn that over and start, and we'll see. Ask a question. And so I'm looking. Oh, I see hands up. You can't see it, but I see hands up. Go ahead.
Piotr or Peter, the United. I heard, but I'd like it kind of clarified. And that word is rural. When you talk about small versus large churches, do you count urban, small versus large, do you take into account rural? Because there are a number of churches that are definitely small by the working definition we've used here, but they are in a large urban centers. Do you take that into account? How did that play out?
Yeah, so in our sample, we're looking at both rural and urban churches, and we realized that you could further subdivide urban into suburban and sort of an urban core, and people have other different definitions. They are both in our study. We're trying to make our samples as representative of our target population as possible. But they're both there. I think that we've been referencing rural churches. This probably has to do with the most recent pastors that we've been interviewing, and probably the top of mind. When we think of rural, we're thinking of churches that might be in a rural setting or in a small town, probably something like 10,000 or less, or that have a connection to to a rural population as their congregants. Does that answer your question, Peter?
Very much so. Thank you.
And this is the congregational silence as we await the next person to pray.
It's interesting. We smile behind our masks because here in Saskatchewan, you can receive city status at 5,000 people in a community. So small is a different term around here.
Yeah, and there certainly are regional differences that we find in terms of the experience of people. You know, we've interviewed small churches in sort of the center of Toronto, and their experience is very different than the churches that we've interviewed in rural Saskatchewan. And what we're trying to look at is to faithfully describe both the similarities and the differences.
Mm-hmm. Peter, again, so in your research, in your questions and answers, do you the most common answer for how pastors sustain themselves, you know, spiritually, energy-wise? There was a question, describe your week, but in the midst of that, what do you hear? How do pastors sustain themselves?
I can take that. Pastors seem to sustain themselves in different ways, but most of them have found a community of support outside of the church, whether that be a ministerial like what you guys are experiencing. Sometimes it's mentorship, and I've seen different models. Sometimes people will go and pursue a mentor on their own. Sometimes that's something that's facilitated by the denomination. We've seen, I spoke with, well, I didn't speak, I was reading through a French interview, and a denomination restructured the way that they approached taking care of their pastors entirely. And rather than having this business model, they really approached it more relationally and saw it as, and started to approach taking care of pastors in terms of both mentorship, but also kind of this leadership training, and then just walking through ministry together. So we've seen a lot of different models, but it usually comes down to relationship. And then maybe Rick, you can talk to sort of the benefits of having these weaker ties outside of your congregation.
Yeah, so Lindsay has referenced a theory by a guy named Granovetter about how communities have strong and weak ties. So strong ties would be what you would find in a small church where everybody knows everybody and everybody's very close, and those are very good ties. But the kinds of things that build into you as a pastor are, generally speaking, the weak ties. And by weak ties, they kind of mean those acquaintances. They are the kinds of people that you might run into at your annual denominational meeting, or at a conference, or just in a different kind of social setting that can pray for you, that can help you look at a problem in a different way, that can build into you maybe through education. And those are the kinds of those are the kinds of ties that help to build you up. And, you know, you may also include in that sort of spiritual retreats where you have a guided retreat where a spiritual director is building into you as well. So one of the things I think that the small church pastors need to be careful to build into their lives, and small churches need to make these opportunities available to small church pastors as well, are these opportunities to have these connections outside of the congregation in order to renew the pastors.
You can tell we live in a great world here where you've had people coming down your stairs and we've had people wandering around. It's great. It feels like we're at home. This is like small church. This is great.
Footsteps even lined up.
Yeah, there was somebody, we're going to love this when it's online. It's going to be great. Any more questions? All right. I have one more question. Is there something that you would say as the study is finished that you on and say to all of us sitting here today, if you look at this area, you'll see your small church flourish in a new way? Is there anything that's coming up in the research that you would say, this is something that we might want to pinpoint?
Magic formula.
Yeah, the magic formula.
The silver bullet.
Lindsay?
I try to avoid silver bullets, but there is a lot of research being done in the States as well on congregational flourishing and pastoral flourishing. And I really think that if the pastor is flourishing, the congregation will. And so I would want to see pastors being invested in and poured into and taken care of. And I think the church will be blessed by extension. So yeah, I would really like to see pastors. I think they're the key. Take care of them. Maybe I'm also biased because I'm married to one. So I'll just put that on the table.
Appreciate your bias.
Yes, we appreciate bias. And these last 3 minutes that you've just been talking, I'm sure they're going to go viral to all of our congregations. It's not a problem. So. Sorry, Rick, did you have something?
You know, when I think about, our observation about congregational covenants, I think that to be aware that congregations have covenants and to try and consciously understand what your covenant is. When we talked with a lot of denominational leaders, some of them expressed frustration at the unwillingness of small churches to change sometimes. And I think that part of this goes back to the way that change works in a small church versus a large church. In a large church, congregations will generally give the leadership of the church over to the pastor or a board. In a small church, the leadership of the church is kind of owned by consensus. Everybody has a say in it, and that change has to take place slowly. And one of the things that I don't think that many denominational leaders understand very well is that the pastor actually does not have the authority to come in and lead until the people feel that the pastor is one of them and is invested in the congregational covenant in the same way that they are. And I think that if we kind of become aware of what our congregational covenants are, then we have an opportunity to stand back and evaluate whether this is really the right mission for our congregation now, and to recognize that whatever change process happens, that's going to have to be a change process that happens through consensus. And I think that, if there's something that I'd be hopeful about is for our congregations to become more conscious of just what are they about, what is their covenant, and to ask the question, is this still kind of the right thing for us as a people of God to be about?
You're bringing up all sorts of questions. Like, I could now go on for about another 30 minutes asking you, how do you get a congregational covenant? How do you bring consensus? What's change look? We're going to save that maybe for another day.
Okay.
And just say thank you, both Lindsay and Rick. Thank you very much for the opportunity just to chat with you, to hear some of what's happening and some of the research that's coming. So we just want to say thank you, and we're all going to wave our hands and thanks again, and forward to what comes next from you both.
Okay, thank you for having us, Ron.
Thank you.
And everybody else behind the masks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.